I'm Jin Kim. Let me start my presentation. Did widows have a renaissance? It's a research on the votive portraits commissioned by widows in early modern Italy. This essay challenges John Kelly's assertion that female chastity and passiveness were generally reinforced in the Renaissance by examining widows' experiences as a commissioner of art often differs from that of wives in early modern Italy. As evidence, the author deals with votive portraits commissioned by widows. Widows often commissioned art on behalf of commemoration of their husbands or son, but they expressed self-consciousness through their portraits by adapting a new perspectival invention of Renaissance. This essay traces the subversion by widows in terms of the commission of art by addressing the representational orientation of altarpieces in the 14th and 15th centuries. In the 15th century, it was common for artists to represent the male donor or donors with their wives together in a painting. It was rare to find a votive image of a solo woman. This essay inspects how the votive portrait of solo woman in the Renaissance altarpiece relates to a widow's autonomy in the historic and social context. Uh, I proposes I propose a more meticulous understanding of widows through the examination of gendered votive images as the index of female agency in the Renaissance, the male-dominant humanist society. Some widows equated with the man by depicting donatrix's self-portraits in the same position and scale as male donor in the paintings through the investigation, this essay suggests that widows were relatively visible with partial freedom and power in Renaissance paintings by comparison to wives. Who were the widow commissioners? Most commissioning women in the Renaissance society were not wives, but widows. The widow had some degree of independence, would receive income from her husband's estate, and could contract an art. Widows represent quite a significant percentage of society. In fact, about a quarter of women in Florence in 1427. However, only the rare heiress would like to be head of her separate household. Few widows were living independently and gained control of their positions. A widow may have not felt free to spend on any large scale, or if she did, might have needed to justify her commission as an investment benefiting her children, such as creating a family chapel. In this sense, an altarpiece for the family chapel was frequently commissioned by a widow. The widow had more chance than a married woman to commission art and architecture, but in many cities, she still did not have the same autonomy as a man because a widow was required to have a legal guardian to validate her legal activities. When we look at a commission by a widow containing an inscription or donatrix portrait, the position from which the widow stated her will or acted and exerted her artistic taste differs from that of a male patron. These circumstances parallel Kelly's assumption. Although widows emphasized the commissioning of funerary monuments for a husband or son, some widows ordered the donatrix portraits for herself to state their hopes for personal salvation and her piety. Through this donatrix image, sometimes a widow overstepped to the private and family-oriented character of a woman's interest, funded a chapel or the mural decoration for the public spaces. A widow was potentially could have been problematic as a subversive agency to the humanistic convention that put a woman in a decorative object in art. Some votive portraits commissioned by widows shows how the widows departed from the passiveness impacted larger communities beyond their private family properties in sexuality and gender context. I'll look at votive portraits commissioned by men. There existed a long tradition in Italian art of female and male votive portraits that were primarily commissioned by men. The donors were required to be identified as different to the holy figures they accompanied, and painters were carefully to distinguish them precisely depicting contemporary dress. Sometimes painters put the commissioners below the holy figures to the side or separate. In the altarpieces Filippo Lippi painted, the donors kneel to honor the Virgin and the angel, but are separated from the event by a low balustrade. In another Filippo painting, the donor is shown kneeling on a pavement below the level of floor on which the holy figures stand. Usually, male donor locates left or center, female donatrix spots right. They are to be thought of as closer to the viewers than the holy figures by the logic of Renaissance perspectival conventions. However, the use of diminutive donor and donatrix figures was widely spreaded throughout the Italian peninsula in the late 15th century. More than a century after the invention of scientific perspective constructions like this. It is significant that no sole donatrix are known to have commissioned realistically sized portrait of themselves until the last quarter of the 15th century. It seems to have taken about 50 years for the logic of the new Florentine perspective allures to reach the female commissioner. Women chose the convention of a votive portrait showing only head, as if the frame of her altarpiece cut off our view of the rest of her figure, like this. And I'll talk about the disturbances of solo donatrix portraits. Whereas in the early Middle Ages of donor portraits were usually of male clerics during the 14th century, it became increasingly common for lay people to have portraits, thus creating more opportunities for the widow. However, most votive images showing a portrait were of a single male donor. Only about 3% of votive portraits were sole lay women. Poses are also gendered since donatrixes were often represented as holding their rosary between their hands, while donors were pictured as bending their bared heads to honor their intercessors. They were also gendered in the sense that during the 15th century, some donors, but never donatrix, were shown kneeling on one knee in a pose analogous to that of feudal homage, like this. Nevertheless, donatrix portraits are of great interest because they presented interesting disturbances of conventional viewing expectations. Donatrix tended to have themselves placed in the position of honor normally reserved for the man to the left in the center of their altarpieces. Like the man usually positioned to the left because of the biblical statements that at the last judgment the blessed step blessed sheep would be placed on the right hand of God, to the viewer's left as the faced God as judge. The donatrix portraits were usually painted on a diminutive scale like this, but mm, from the late 15th century, more realistically sized images began to be used occasionally by these well-off widows, showing the donatrix on the same scale as the holy figures in the narrative she had commissioned. The eventual adoption of realistically sized self-portraits by donatrixes was associated with enhanced opportunities for the widow. Despite widows not being advised to draw attention to themselves, let alone in the public arena, these votive self-portraits rather often seem to have had an eye to an audience outside the woman's family. Even though these self-portraits of widows were modest in size, they did guide the viewers to worship the spiritual figures revered by donatrix. Okay, now realistically sized votive portraits commissioned by widows. This section investigates three realistically sized votive portraits as evidence of a manifestation of widows' visibility. Penthesilea, a high-rank widow, commissioned a full-size votive portrait showing her body. In this altarpiece, Jerome introduces the Countess kneeling to receive the blessing of the Christ child. Penthesilea is differentiated from the brilliantly tinted holy figures through her simple clothing, her low position, and her apparent nearness to the spectator. Despite Penthesilea's modestly downcast gaze, her decision to have herself shown full size and full length, albeit kneeling, was a bold one. When Penthesilea is in the right corner, in an analogous altarpiece, a male donor located to the left. The second example was made for a widow of lower rank, being the wife of a medical doctor. The full-length portrait of Donna Lucrezia is on a funerary altarpiece she commissioned for herself, her parents, her first husband, and her daughter at her chapel. The large panel shows a realistically sized portrait of donatrix in the foreground kneeling slightly to the left from the center. Archival research suggests the qualities of a woman who could order one of the few full-length votive self-portraits for a woman of lesser rank, her education in loving books and writing her wills, her value of feminine, her piety, and her self-confidence in possessing wealth in her own life. Most of the votive portraits considered were made for a mixed audience. The widows are shown more or less in profile. leading viewers to look at the people they honored. Nevertheless, the final example, the higher altar commissioned by Donna Marietta, overturns Dick's expectations. The image shows the donatrix with eyes downcast, but turned so as to be visible full face to male audiences, who seated at the core stall in a church. The portrait is a kneeling woman whose body is masked at the sides by her companions. Marietta was a widow of a Venetian patrician and had prestigious connections in her own right. The male saint standing to the right have passive roles in the narrative, with their face shown in profile in shadow. It was Magdalena, the donatrix advocate, and her female companions who were highlighted as the more active participants in expressive poses. All three with their faces and bodies turned towards the viewer. According to this analysis, this altarpiece is a most unusual and innovative image. Marietta had entered the respect of the Dominican monastery through her extensive generosity and was recorded as a magnificent Madonna at church, which was the public space. Even until the 15th century, donors and donatrix widely commissioned the diminutive scale of votive portraits. However, male commissioners took the new full-size portraits as normal when new perspectival rules were developed from the 1420s onwards. But so women commissioners did not do so for more than a half century. As John Kelly argued, women had historically a different relationship to the new opportunities of Renaissance to that experienced by men. However, widows, one of the marginalized groups, made some disturbances challenging the Renaissance male supremacy society. Compared to the feudal society, widows had more chances to commission their votive portraits than they have had. Widows often commissioned art for themselves, while most wives were not accessible to it. Furthermore, widows observed new artistic styles, embraced the arts with the radical application of a new way of expression that was invented in the Renaissance and enhanced the visibility of their presence. Female independence, self-confidence, and autonomy were articulated through the contemporary experiment of art. Widows led spectators to follow the narrative that the donatrix deploys through altarpieces in the public spaces. Through the activities of commissioning art, widows conducted subjective roles as female members of the society in early modern Italy. This challenge to the assertion of John Kelly that women did not have a Renaissance calls for a need of an interrogation about the women who were liminal.